Welcome to Canterbury Cast, the podcast where you'll find sermons, conversations, and all things Canterbury UMC. We're glad you're here.
Today we come to the final sermon in a sermon series, EMBARK. We've talked about things like how do you leave the dock and how do you recruit your crew? How do you bring the people on board that you need to have on board? What do you do when you can't see beyond the horizon? And today we're going to talk about how do you navigate in the midst of a storm? How do you find your bearing and what do you do? And how do you handle your life in the midst of a storm? Now, you may or may not feel like your life is in the midst of a storm right now. I don't know how to break it to you. Life has storms in it. There are going to be some that come along somewhere in life. It's going to hit you. It may not hit you right now. It may be down the road. I hope you somehow cruise through life, kind of, sort of. And yet, it's often in the storms that we learn a great deal. The scripture that we read today from the Gospel of Mark is one of many in the Bible that talk about wind and water coming together for something notable and significance. In Genesis, the very beginning of creation, the wind is over the water and hovering over the water. And when those two come together, creation itself begins and life starts to change. Everything around it starts to become new and beautiful. Noah in the ark is a famous one. We read that story to our children, and yet it's when they're in the ark and the wind starts to blow around and blows the water to where land starts to appear again, and a new and fresh start happens. In Exodus, as the people who have been in slavery begin their journey, they come to a place where the wind begins to blow across the water because they are being pursued by the Egyptian army, and they escape across the sea into the wilderness, and then the wind stops and the water comes back, and they begin their journey free. And at the end of their journey, the wind and the water come together again, and the river Jordan is parted, and they were able to enter into the promised land. Perhaps the most famous is that of Jonah. Jonah on the ship trying to avoid what God has called him to do. Jonah, who comes to a place on the ship where the winds and the waves have become so rough that he is thrown or throws himself overboard. We know the rest of that story. He doesn't want to go and share God's forgiving nature with his enemy, the people of Nineveh. Now, on the Sea of Galilee, where the Gospel of Mark story occurs, on the Sea of Galilee, several of you have been on the Sea of Galilee before. Raise your hand if you've been on the Sea of Galilee before. Okay. I was with a group just a couple of years ago. We were on the Sea of Galilee. We got on the boat. It was flat calm when we got on the boat. Before we reached the other side of the Sea of Galilee, wind had come down the mountains, running across the water. The rough water started to come up, and our seasoned captain, one who had been in that boat many times, had been on that water many times in his life. This was his job. This is what he did. Our seasoned captain had to try to dock multiple times because the wind had gone from nothing to significant without warning. There was no change in the clouds above like we might see here. It just changed in terms of the wind. It changed unexpectedly. We have the story of Jesus in the boat. He's asleep in the bow. And they're on the boat in the Sea of Galilee. And remember who some of these disciples are. People who have fished for a living on that sea. And they are afraid. Now, I personally like the fact that Jesus is asleep. I like that he's asleep and he's in the bow and he's up there, because if you read before this section in Mark, he's been preaching and teaching and doing all sorts of things with all of the people. He's been in Galilee. The crowds are growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and no wonder he's exhausted. He gets into the boat. He falls asleep in the boat, and the disciples' responsibility is to get him to the other side. And they wake him up when the storm gets so bad that they are truly afraid. And he basically says to them, "You have got to be kidding me. Have you not seen all that we have done? And you're waking me up over this? You of all people should be able to know how to manage this storm." Jesus rebukes the storm because nothing is beyond his ability. But Jesus is not just mad about them being worried about the storm, even though Jesus is in the boat. He is also mad because they can't see what's really happening. Every time in our Holy Scriptures, wind and water combine, the Bible will tell us about something new that is occurring. Every time the wind and the water come together in our Bible, something new is on the horizon. Something new is about to happen. Something important is about to occur. Go back and think about it. In Genesis, whether it's creation or whether it's Noah, we have a new beginning. In Exodus, a new land for the people to enter into. Whether it is wilderness or it is promised land, they enter into new places. Jonah is going to preach God to a new people, the Ninevites, who have been brutal and harsh. They have been their enemies all along. It is the message of sharing with your enemies the good news of God. A new thing is happening all over the place when wind and water combine. According to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has not only been teaching and preaching to his people, he has said to the disciples, it is time for us to go to the other side of the lake. It's time for us to see the other side and to go and share the good news with the people there, the Gerasenes, the Gentiles, the people that they avoid with all of their being. And the disciples do not want to go. We all come to those places in our life where we're comfortable, those places in our life where we recognize that, hey, I'm with my people, this is good, and they're listening and they want to hear me, and more are coming, and wonderful things are happening. And Jesus comes along and says, okay, time to do something else. Time to go to the other side. And as they go to the other side, well, a storm like they're not used to comes up. And when they get to the other side, they encounter a man who is all kinds of crazy. He's a man that his own people have been so scared of him, they've tried to chain him up in a cemetery, to put him in chains and lock him down there so he couldn't come around them anymore and scare them. And he is now running around with loose chains binding his wrists and his hands, and he is naked. And he is running around all kinds of crazy and possessed. And don't you know, the disciples, when they step on shore and they look, and the first person they encounter in this community is this man who is filled with demons. And they look and point back to the water where the storm had almost swamped their boat, and they stand on this land looking at this man. Don't you know, they just kind of turned at Jesus and said, see, we should have stayed where we were. It was all good over there. But Jesus, being Jesus, brings peace to the storm and to the individual. Jesus speaks peace into the storm and into the individual, and it changes everything. Whenever we encounter storms, there are things for us to learn from sailors, from fishermen, and from Christ. When we're in the midst of a storm, sometimes it's hard to think. It's hard to know what to do. It's hard to even see where you're trying to go. It's hard to know what's going to be next. First, let me remind you, this story reminds us deeply and powerfully that Jesus is in the boat. There's no storm you're going to go through in your life where Jesus isn't already in the boat. Now, sometimes you may feel like he's asleep. And it's okay to wake him up, to make sure he is aware and he knows what's going on in your life and what you understand. Today we call that prayer. It's okay to pray. It's okay to pray all the time, but it's particularly okay to pray in the midst of the storm, to talk to Jesus about what's going on in your life and how you might encounter this, how you might understand that you are not alone, and how peace might be spoken into your life in the midst of the storm. As you are entering the storm, sailors will tell you to secure everything of value on the deck, to tie down the things that are most important to you, to check and look at the things that you really value in your life. When you're in the midst of the storm, pay attention to the things that are most important to you. Make sure they're safe. Pay attention to the things you really value, because in a storm, it's easy to lose sight of them. Next, turn your bow into the waves and into the wind. Take it head on. If you're already in the storm, turn your boat into the wind and into the storm, because as you take those waves head on, they're less likely to swamp you. But as soon as you try to outrun it, as soon as you try to avoid it, as soon as you try to pretend like this storm isn't bad and you turn sideways to it, it can sideswipe you and capsize you. Some of you are in the midst of a storm right now in your life, and you're trying to pretend like it's not real, like it's not as bad as it might really be. Take it head on. Take it seriously. Go right into it. The next thing to do is to slow down, but keep moving. Slow down and keep moving. Make sure that you have enough power to direct where you're going, because the only thing you have control over in the midst of any part of life, much less a storm, is you. You have control over you. You don't have control over the storm. You don't have control over the other people. You have control over you. So keep moving, but slow down so that you're not moving recklessly. There is a temptation sometimes when we're in a storm to try to just get through it. And the desire to just get through it can sometimes take us completely off course, and we lose control. I remember talking with a sailor once who was a hand on a ship. He had been a captain of a ship many times in his own life, but in this case, he was serving as a deckhand. And I asked him something about the captain, and he said, the thing I admire most about this captain is this captain stays calm in the midst of some of the biggest storms I've ever seen. Do your best to stay calm and focused on what is before you, on taking care of the next thing and then the next thing and then the next thing. Make sure that you stay focused on where it is and what's happening with you in your life and what you need to do next. It's easy to become overwhelmed and paralyzed. We often speak of the calm before the storm, but in reality, it is after the storm that the air is the clearest. And God puts a clear sign before us of hope on the other side of the storm. This is the truth in our Holy Scriptures time and time again. On the other side of the storm, there is hope waiting on us. For Noah, it was a rainbow. For the freed slaves, the promised land. For the people of Nineveh, it was knowing God and repenting to such a powerful way that the Bible even tells us that their livestock repented. That's saying something. For the followers of Jesus, it was the first invitation extended to the Gentiles to be a follower of Christ. And without them going through that storm, we are likely not here today. It's on the other side of that storm that the world began to open up, and it was from a Gerasene demoniac who is possessed by many demons, who Jesus speaks peace into his life, who becomes the first Gentile evangelist to that community. Jesus speaks peace into our storm. It does not always mean that the storm goes away, but it does mean that we have the ability to make it to the other side, to make it through the storm, to learn and see the symbols of hope that await us there. If you find yourself in the middle of a storm now, let me remind you of all we've talked about in the sermon series. Who's going to be in your crew to help you get to the other side? What are you going to use to see beyond where you are today? What are the choices you will make to navigate through rough waters, to make it to the other side and experience the hope? Questions for life as we embark on our journey. Thanks be to God.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about what's going on at Canterbury, follow us on social media or visit our website at canterburyumc.org.